It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I note among the attendees there are several acquaintances and colleagues, and we're especially thankful to have you joining us this morning and look forward to your contributions. Mark and I, as we were putting this webinar together, thought that it would be useful to share our thoughts, but also to encourage lots of questions. Our experience has been that quite often the dialogue that ensues from responding to questions is one of the more rewarding aspects of these webinars. We get started just by introducing myself, and then I'll ask Mark to introduce himself as well. So my name is Allan Bird. I'm the president of the COSI Group. The COSI Group was formed about 15 years ago in 2001 at the request of several clients that we were working with. We're in search of an effective tool to help them assess their global leadership talent and look at ways to do a better job in selection as well, wanting to make sure that they selected people who they could drop into international assignments fairly quickly. In addition to my role at the COSI Group, I'm the Darla and Frederick Brodsky Trustee Professor in Global Business at the DeMoore McKim School of Business in Northeastern University, which is located in Boston. So that's a quick bit about me and about the COSI Group. I'm going to hand it over to Mark for his introduction.
Hi, I'm Mark Mendenhall, and I work with Allan in the COSI Group, a partner in that group. Also have been here at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga since 1989. I came here to take the J. Burton Frierson Chair of Excellence in Business Leadership, an endowed chair, co-funded really with the state and private donor, and have been working in this area since, oh my gosh, since really the late 70s. I got my PhD in '83, but was writing and publishing on intercultural effectiveness even before that. Really, when I started out in 1983, I realized I wound up, looking back now, taught one of the first international management courses in business schools in North America. There were a lot of international business courses, but not so much fine-tuned looking at global management, global leadership. So been doing research and consulting in this area since that time. So hopefully won't bore you with a lot of war stories today.
With that, let's get into our conversation. And what Mark and I decided to do was that I would spend 5 or 10 minutes introducing part of the content we prepared. Then I'll hand off to Mark, and he'll follow up. And then we'd really, as indicated earlier, like to open this up to questions and to go the direction that would be most useful for many of you. Let me get started by talking about the need. As I've looked through the field, every survey of CEOs of global corporations that I've checked in on in the last 25 years has identified the same key issue. Often it's at the top of the list. If not at the top of the list, it's among the top 2 or 3 items. And that is, there is a deficit of global leadership talent, global leadership capability. One of the more widely cited studies from 2010 by IBM found that not only was that a major concern, but that roughly half the CEOs felt that they were going to continue to experience that deficit for at least 5 years into the future. That was 2010, so we're into the future 5 years, and more recent surveys indicate that that continues to be an issue. One of the studies by PricewaterhouseCoopers found that roughly 80% of CEOs felt that they had lost global business because of an inability to staff international positions with global leadership talent. It was the personnel shortage that was slowing the company down. It wasn't that the company didn't have the other resources to keep pace with the potential for growth. So with that in mind, it becomes all the more imperative that we understand how to identify and how to develop global leadership talent. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, I think it's helpful to think about what are the common questions we get as we confront that question. I've put up a list of some of those. One of the first is, does everybody in the organization need to be globalized? we recognize that there may be some different degrees in there, but often companies are struggling with just who exactly in the organization needs to be developed, who needs to be assessed as to whether they need development. Another common question is, how many global leaders do we need? Can you get by with a small cadre of global leaders, or do you need a large number? Do you need deep bench strength? Other questions: do we have the time? Do we have the resources to develop global leaders? What will it take to develop them? And right in the middle of that is this a real priority of top management? Often we find a real disconnect between the human resource development leaders that we're talking to and C-suite executives who give a nod to the need for that, but often don't express the enthusiasm that moving in that direction will require in terms of resources. And then what are some of the issues around aligning our overall human resource policies to help develop global leaders and to support them once we have them in position? And then some final thoughts is that given the different industries and markets, do global leaders need to be trained in industry-specific ways? Are there different needs, say, for somebody in the resource extraction industry in terms of global leadership development as opposed to, say retail or financial services? So these are some of the questions we've got, and hopefully these have spurred or aligned with some of the questions that you may be bringing to this webinar this morning. I'm saying this morning because it's morning in Boston. I recognize that it may not be morning elsewhere. For us, as we look at this issue and as we've talked with clients, one of the central questions, if not the central question, is do we make or buy global leadership talent? Given the strong pressures that I cited earlier, have we got the time to develop them, or do we need to go out and purchase them? Alternatively, if we feel like we have the time and have the resources, how do we go about developing them? And I would note in both of those situations, assessment is critical. If the decision is to buy global leadership talent, then how do we assess whether that talent has the capability we're looking for? How do we identify that? We've come to recognize that assessment plays a critical role in that. Conversely, if we decide to make the talent in-house, if we decide to grow it in-house through various development programs, on-the-job training and the like, we need to assess because we need to establish baseline levels in order to determine what to develop and think about how to go about developing that. So in either case, it seems like assessment plays an important role, should play an important role. The next question is, what do we measure? And this is an interesting question, and companies have come down in a lot of different directions. Many companies have competency profiles or frameworks that they work with. As they moved globally, often they found it necessary to revise or redevelop or refine those frameworks. Note that one company, and I'd say they strike me as fairly typical, had an 11 competency framework that they were working with. But we also find that in some instances, companies have gone to as many as 250 competencies. I'm not sure how they go about measuring all of those. That seems like a rather large task. But the point is simply that there's a lot to look at. And indeed, my review of all of the literature and all of the research on competencies have identified more than 150 different competencies that scholars and executives have identified as central. Now, certainly within that framework, there's a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of, I would say, commonality across the competencies. But what I take away from this is that there's a real challenge in identifying what are the competencies to measure. At the COSI group, our focus tends to be on those competencies that we would call foundational, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. More broadly, as we think about competencies in general, we can think about competencies that are job-specific or role-specific. Competencies, for example, around the use of various software technologies, say in data analysis, represents often a role-specific competency. Not all roles require, not all positions require data analysis competency, but that can be very specific, and in some particular global leadership positions may be a critical competency. Other competencies are not so specific. They tend to be more general. Often, and many of the competencies we study are more in the area of what we would call dispositional capabilities or cognitive orientation capabilities. So within the COSI group, we've focused on measuring what we call the foundational global competencies and recognize that those require time and effort to develop if we're developing them, and certainly if we're going to buy them, that it requires careful assessment to make sure that we've identified them and are confident that we have a good measure of that. We see these foundational competencies, and one of the reasons we focus on them is because they are, in our minds, the mortar that locks in a group of other more general competencies, and I would say competencies that companies often feel more comfortable around because they feel like they have good measurements of those already. Just like the difference between good mortar and not so good mortar in a wall, the stronger those foundational competencies, the stronger the overall leadership capability that we see within global leaders. So a number of years back, Mark and Joyce, another colleague at the COSI group, undertook an assessment of all the different competencies that they could find across all of the research, and ended up grouping, you recall I mentioned up to 150, well they grouped, I think it was about 50 or 60, and Mark can correct me if I've got this wrong, competencies, and they began essentially to sort them, dropping them into buckets, if you will. And when they got done with that sort, they had 6 buckets, and as they looked at those 6 buckets, they could see that they clearly fell into 2 groups. One group we'll call the intercultural competencies, and they drop those into buckets of relationship management, perception management, and self-management. And the other they referred to as global business competencies, and these seem to break down in 3 ways. One were competencies around global business expertise. Do you understand the business? Do you have insight into how things work? Do you know what the key drivers are within the industry, what the levers are to pull, what the buttons are to push to be effective in that business context? A second set of competencies was around global organizing. Do you know how to structure the company? Do you know how to arrange work roles? Do you know how to sort out lines of authority and reporting lines? And can you manage those structures that you create? So this really has to do with the internal functioning of the organization. And then the last one was a vision. Do you have a sense of, and can you develop and relay that to others, communicate that to others about where the organization or where your unit should be heading and how you should get there? So that was on the one side, and on the other side, the intercultural competencies, they broke it down into competencies that had to do with managerial perception about understanding situations, competencies with managing people, and competencies related to managing self. So those 3 mortar factors, perception management, relationship management, and self-management, are the ones that we focus on when we look at assessing global leadership competency. That's not to say the others are not important. They are important, but our research suggests that the mortar that holds the bricks together, the bricks can be solid, but if there's nothing binding them together, they make for a weak structure. And so we focus on that. I'm going to hand this over to Mark at this point and let him talk more about those competencies. And if I've gone a slide too far, Mark, go ahead and back up.
No, we're fine. We're fine. Thanks, Allan. The fundamental competencies, you'll see these in different colors. They coincide with the conceptual buckets that Allan just discussed. So non-judgmentalness, openness, tolerance of ambiguity, cosmopolitanism, interest flexibility, all are within the perception management dimension. The competencies listed in orange all are competencies that empirical research shows these are the competencies that come up over and over again as being critical. That's in the relationship management dimension. And the final competencies relate to self-management. One thing that's quite interesting, and probably as all of you have been know, probably many of you have lived overseas or worked in global contexts, it's very taxing, it's very stressful, it's very, very intrapersonally challenging. And so the competencies of optimism, self-confidence, self-identity, emotional resilience, non-stress tendency. If a person is blessed, just frankly, some people just naturally don't get stressed out as much as others. It doesn't make a person good, bad, or indifferent. It's just helpful in a global context. And then, of course, stress management. We could spend time going over each of these in detail, but we're not going to do that today. There's plenty of resources we can provide you that will enable you to drill down and understand the nuances of all of these specific competencies. But this is what we measure. We measure these competencies. Without these, it seems that the more, if you will, kind of hard competencies of business knowledge, global business knowledge, things like that. In other words, without these, it's hard to deploy those others. So the question many of you might have is, how do you develop these? Or can you develop these? We can talk about this later, but what we found with our clients at COSI and before that as independent consultants is that there's a fundamental process of developing these foundational global competencies or enhancing them or learning more about them to deploy them strategically. First, you have to have individual assessment. We have just found that without understanding where you're at, if you're an individual, you can't move forward. People aren't aware they even have these competencies. They're not aware of the degree to which they have them. So individual assessment for development is just absolutely critical. The second phase after developing that self-awareness requires shifting into a new learning context. What we found and what the research shows is that simply going to exec ed programs for the most part, actually it's pretty clear, really doesn't develop these types of competencies. It might develop a lot of those higher order type of competencies in terms of hard skills, but these foundational competencies that are so necessary to deploying those harder global business knowledge type skills, it seems to require a new learning context. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And that what it requires in that learning context is moving from just knowing about these, moving beyond self-awareness to actually experientially, rigorously behaving, doing these competencies. And we'll give you a couple of examples of that. So phase one, how do you help somebody get self-awareness about these competencies? Inventories, we've developed the Global Competencies Inventory. We've developed Intercultural Effectiveness Scale. There's other people that have developed some inventories. All these are very, very helpful. In fact, necessary in order to help people start to understand where am I at in these competencies. A second aspect of self-awareness that I like to use, in addition to inventories, once they gain a little self-awareness that way, is to have them subjectively self-assess themselves. This can be also done with 360 instruments that are more finely tuned to this. It can even be done by having people just simply ask others about these competencies if they see them in them, etc. But having an inventory is very, very helpful to get the ball rolling. Level of developmental readiness. Developmental readiness basically means you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make her drink it, right? Developmental readiness just means how much does somebody want to learn these competencies? Okay, moving into the new context, once we have the self-awareness, the new context, what we found from both practice and the research literature is that in order for people to develop these competencies, They have to be put into a situation that's highly experiential, that's novel. It's not just, in their same type of day-to-day environment. There has to be some challenge associated with it, and there has to be a certain threshold of risk. In other words, what we found, this is the brutal facts, what we found is people don't tend to develop these competencies unless they're put into a new type of learning context, which is outside the classroom. Another way to put, many of you have heard of the 70-20-10 framework. 10% of learning is sort of traditional classroom, workshop, seminar-based. 20% is talking with other people, kind of having friends, having peer groups where you talk and share. But 70% is learning by doing, and that's where we like to take people. The COSI group, a lot of times we work with individual global leaders. We have them develop personal development plans around specific competencies, and we help them develop a plan on where they work on this daily for at least 15 minutes to half an hour a day, and then we set up an accountability schedule where they have to report to us kind of in a coaching situation. However, I found that even without traditional coaching, just having people work a personal development plan with accountability, I find that they can actually increase in these competencies on their own without a lot of high-level coaching if they have at least an average level of developmental readiness. Coaching, of course, lots of different levels of coaching, that can be extremely powerful in developing these competencies if the first two phases exist. And then, of course, I've talked about accountability processes. We have found that without accountability, people tend to revert back to sort of the mean of laziness, so to speak. It does require some accountability to move forward. I won't go into a lot of detail about best practices. There's an excellent article in Academy of Management Learning and Education that studied PricewaterhouseCoopers Project Ulysses, where they take global leaders or people who are high potentials, they put them in teams with a little bit of training, send them overseas for 2 months to work in developing countries and to solve problems locally with host nationals that have nothing to do with their skill set per se. And what the research has found on this is because of the shift of the context, because of the immersion, it triggers the ability of these people to develop these foundational competencies that we've talked about. IBM's Corporate Service Corps takes a similar approach based on Peace Corps, and we can talk about some of these later, but the outcomes are highly effective in competency development and on other positive outcomes as well. What do you do if you can't afford to do some very immersive, very expensive program like that? USB in Switzerland wanted to increase the intercultural competencies in its people a while ago. What they did is they took them off the job for about a month to 6 weeks, and rather than send them overseas in a very costly kind of situation, had them volunteer in local organizations, in other words, not going to the bank or anything, but just spending time in organizations that worked with immigrants, worked with HIV patients, etc. And they found just doing that domestically was enough of a shift in context to develop some of these foundational competencies we've been talking about. And I've already mentioned personal development plans. Let me just give you an example of how that works very, very quickly, and then we can get to some question and answers because we don't want to talk the whole time. So I was working with an Austrian accountant, and she was finishing a high-level MBA program. And after we assessed her using the Global Competencies Inventory, she scored quite low in tolerance of ambiguity. And when I met with her one-on-one, she said, that's me. That's an accurate assessment. She said, I plan my life out. My daily planner is planned by the hour all week. I know exactly what I'm going to do. The nature of the job and schooling, I guess, was such that it was quite predictable, and she had a general kind of personality tendency to have a high need for control, and she didn't like ambiguity at all. She goes, so I need to work on that. I worked with her for 6 weeks. The first week she studied tolerance of ambiguity to really understand it. And then the second week she developed a personal development plan. And the key to these is not to start out large, but to start out doing concrete activities that can influence a competency. So this is what she did. She said, I'm a control freak with myself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to program in ambiguity into my schedule. So what she did was she said, I better go with this kind of slowly. The first week she scheduled in 3 hours that week. She did a few other activities, but she scheduled in 3 hours that were blank. And after the first week, she reported to me that it completely freaked her out and made her it stressed her out. She got to like Thursday at 3 p.m. and she didn't know what to do because nothing was planned. She goes, what should I do? I don't know. She kind of wandered around. By the end of 6 weeks, however, she had scheduled in at least an hour each day, sometimes longer. And she was cooking. She was reading novels during that time. She was exploring aspects of herself that had been suppressed since childhood. And she actually began to look forward to those times where she could have some ambiguity in her life. I followed up with her 6 months later and asked her how things were going. She said, well, about a month and a half after our relationship had ended, because it was an MBA class, I kept doing it. She said, but then because of lack of accountability, I didn't have to report to you. It sort of just tailed off. And she said, about that time, I took a new job at a multinational company doing global accounting for the company, which of course is lots different than doing it at the national level. Very ambiguous, very vague, not a lot of right answers. And she said, I moved into that role very comfortably. It was okay. And she said, I realized that after I'd been working in that role for a while that I couldn't have done that without having undergone first that personal development plan. So we see people progress and expand the degree to which they have these competencies, but it can only be done in certain ways. It cannot be done through just traditional classroom workshop. There's a place for that, but only as it might help self-awareness to some degree. So that is our introduction, and we hope that might stimulate a few questions, and we'd like to hear those questions either verbally or in the question box here or in the chat box, but we would love to discuss with you our experiences and to see if they have any value for you in what you're struggling with. Allan, any final thoughts?
No, I think we've laid a foundation here for a wider ranging discussion and exploration. So let's turn the time back over to our moderator to see if we've got questions. I see at least one that's come in, but I wonder if there might be others.
Sure. This is Nicole, and we have a question from another Mark that says, I'm curious if our speakers utilize any mindfulness methods and somatic perspective/exercises.
I'll let Allan answer in a second, but one of the things I have seen and found, and actually in the Kozai group there's 5 partners, we're all pretty different, in terms of how we like to do things. And what I have found is that because we're dealing with really foundational kinds of intercultural competencies, competencies that actually can be applied domestically as well as globally, that the methods that we're used to using in our own individual consulting and coaching, we tend to apply to these. I personally don't use any specific mindfulness methods or the somatic exercises. Most of what I do is based on cognitive behavior therapy. And so when I work with people, I'm really working, from kind of a clinical psychological model. I found that cognitive behavior therapy is just so highly effective around behavioral change, cognitive change, etc., that it works for me really effectively in working with global leaders on these competencies. Essentially, what I did with that Austrian accountant, it's not what I did, it was a framework that was essentially cognitive behavior therapy. And so if you want to look, if anybody's interested in that, I've written a couple of articles about that. I can send those to you or give you the sources where you can find those. But my general recommendation is to learn about these competencies, understand that they're the mortar that allows hard competencies to be deployed more strategically, and then use the existing tools that you already have that you're already good at for the most part. But I would like to learn more about mindfulness methods. Maybe in some ways it can be argued cognitive behavior therapy relates highly to that. But so that's how I would respond to that, Allan.
Yeah, I would just follow up on Mark's comment about using the tools that you're comfortable with and that you have available to you. It's also very much, we haven't talked or gone into much detail about professional or personal development plans, but my inclination is always to let the individual drive this process. I might think I know what will work for them or what's good for them, and I can make some suggestions or put some ideas out there. But if it's not an idea that the individual embrace and the individual will get excited about, then usually they won't follow through. I've worked with some coaches who have used some mindfulness approaches, some mindfulness techniques. I myself have not used them, but that I would say is more a reflection of my background and training, and like Mark, haven't gotten up to speed on those sorts of things. Most of the work I do tends to be much more driven by what individuals tell me. So if an individual comes to me and says, I want to work on non-judgmentalness, we'll talk about that, and there may be some mindfulness practices in there. I would think particularly with regard to non-judgmentalness, where mindfulness approaches would be effective. But I usually let them drive that process. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of great questions in here. The next one I'll say is from Maya that says, how do you develop a global leader who lacks EQ?
Okay, I'll jump in and then Allan can jump in. Is that okay?
That's fine.
All right. Okay, so what you're dealing with is someone who lacks emotional intelligence or is fairly low in some of those dimensions. The challenge I have found in working with those people is it comes down for me a lot of times to the level of their developmental readiness. Are they high in developmental readiness, medium in it, or low in it? Okay. The first step is to assess them, because I have found a lot of times people low in emotional intelligence who are high-level managers or managers may not think they are. Some are aware they're low, but some are not. So in either case, whether they are aware that they're low in it or they're not aware that they're low in it and they think that everybody else just needs to adjust to them, the first point is an assessment. It really is, because then you have some kind of data to show them that they may have strengths in some areas, but they also kind of have some areas that they could work on. The question at this point is, do they accept that? This is my view, and it's kind of a wintry, cold, brutal fact. After they've been given some feedback that maybe they have some areas they could work on, what do they do with that feedback? Do they freeze it out? Do they get defensive? Do they criticize the feedback? In other words, do they exhibit low developmental readiness? I have found that until the problem of developmental readiness is solved in people with, maybe low emotional intelligence, it's impossible to move forward. So rather than try to force them down a path, I generally, frankly, I haven't wound up working with lots of people like that, gratefully, but the ones that I have, I've learned that I have to just ask them questions about their developmental readiness. Are you committed to increase your global leadership skills? Or deep down, do you just want to stay where you're at? And if you deep down just want to stay where you're at, what's the implications of that? And this is where the coaching comes in, where it's a discussion. It may take time, but until they kind of increase that developmental readiness, if you force a personal plan on them, they won't do it. Or they'll say they do it, and they really, I found with them developmental readiness, addressing that first is really important. Allan, what are your thoughts?
If I can kind of segue and move us in a different direction, and I'll talk about some things that I think directly address that question, but also apply more broadly to the development of other competencies. Once you have an assessment, the data that Mark was talking about, I think of it as a mirror that you hold up to somebody and you ask them to look in the mirror, and then they decide, do I like what I see there? What do I think about what I'm seeing in the mirror? Do I want to break the mirror? Or do I get upset and say, well, the mirror's not accurate, or there's something wrong with it? But once you have that data in hand and begin to think about that data, the question becomes, what do I do with this? And when I talk with individuals about how to develop, I break it down into 3 types of development. The first is leverage. If your competencies are relatively high in an area, that doesn't mean you're all set. There's often tremendous potential to figure out how to leverage. If I'm good at, we talked about tolerance of ambiguity, we're talking about EQ. So if I'm good at interpersonal engagement, I like engaging with people who are different from me. I like exploring relationships, and I know we were talking about low EQ, but if that's something I'm good at, how can I leverage that? How can I use that to greater effectiveness in the other work that I do? So leverage is one. I'm not good at it, and that brings us to the current question, somebody who's low in EQ. It seems to me there are 2 directions you can go. One is, and I see that as almost an immediate consideration, what can I do to compensate for being low in this area? Okay, this is not one of my strong suits, so what can I do to compensate, to offset the fact? If I'm low in EQ, are there other mechanisms I can rely on? Are there ways to structure situations so that my EQ weaknesses are less apparent or less likely to be dysfunctional or derailing to what I'm trying to accomplish? So that's the one side. And then the other one is develop. Do I want to develop this? If I'm low on EQ, if I'm low on interpersonal engagement, what do I want to do to try and develop or raise up this competency? So I think in terms of leverage, compensate, and develop, and then working with that individual saying, okay, which way do we want to go with this? If their score is not high, obviously we're not going to do leverage. If their score is low, then the question becomes, do we compensate or we develop? And we may decide in some instances, I'm just going to compensate. I'm going to find some other mechanisms, structuring situations, support staff, whatever, that won't be a critical concern. And then on other occasions, I'm going to say, well, the nature of this job and where I'm trying to be in terms of my competency development, this is something I really need to work on. And then we'll tackle that through a professional development plan. Here are the steps I'm going to take, and over time, here's how I'll improve.
Yeah, one of the benefits, like Alan's talking about, is a really good assessment is it shows you what your strengths are. Most people are not aware of their strengths. And like Alan's saying, basically, if you can help people see that they're stronger in areas than they may have thought they were stronger in, they can use those areas to help them actually develop competencies that they're weaker in.
Yeah, if we flip this and say I'm high in interpersonal engagement,
yeah,
and I'm low in tolerance of ambiguity, then I can leverage my interest and my willingness to have conversations and talk with people who are different than me as a means to explore greater ambiguity.
Yeah.
Instead of meeting those people in more controlled circumstances, I might meet up with them and then use that relationship to get them to take me to places that are more ambiguous. So that would represent a leveraging strategy where I'm going to use my competency in one area to help me develop in another.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in from Travis that says, I really like the assessment criteria. They seem to be largely personal. What are your thoughts on the gating factors for professional capabilities? More specifically, do you think it should be required that the individual be high-performing and/or high potential? In your accountant example, do we presuppose that she was an excellent, high-performing, high-potential accountant?
I'll let you start first on this, Mark. We seem to have a sequence going.
A tag team. What we know from research is that people sent to these like IBM Peace Corps programs, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Smith, Glass. I mean, all these. It all starts with the fact that these people are good at the hard, what I'm going to call, the hard skills, especially domestically. In other words, these people are bright, these people are sharp, these people are high performers. Then they start to move into areas that are more intercultural and global in nature. And interestingly, some of the competencies that enabled them to be such high performers domestically, they don't have the competencies they need to be global all the time. And so, yes, we can make that assumption. Most of the time, people are assessed on their technical and professional abilities before going on an international assignment, whatever. By far and away, the biggest criterion of why people are even working overseas is that they're very good at what they did domestically.
Yeah, I would just, and I would add to that, often they've demonstrated, and in an international context, if we're talking about somebody who's been working internationally, we know that there are significant differences as you move up from lower managerial levels to mid-level management positions. We know there's a significant leap in what's required of people as they move from mid to senior level positions. The nature of the job, the scope of the job, and often what identifies them at the mid-level position is what I would call their operational excellence. So they're really good at managing at that level, but it's very hard for them to make the step up to the next level. And part of what makes it difficult is that it requires, if we can stick with our bricks and mortar analogy, the bricks become less important and the mortar becomes more important. And so they may have some capabilities, but they don't appreciate that they need to rely on those capabilities much more. And often that's what I've seen, that move to from mid to senior is usually a wake-up call with regard to those for example, the intercultural, interpersonal skills. But it may just as well be with the self-management, things that they were doing that that allowed them to function or be effective at that level. But generally, the people we're talking about are people who are on their way up, who are high performers, and because they're high performers, are being put in more critical positions. I think that's the nature of where we are with human resource management right now. Is you want your A talent in the A positions, and then that's where companies also sink their largest investment.
And the problem is, of course, you're assessing A talent at a specific level, but A positions are really A plus G, right? They're A plus global, and before they were A plus domestic or whatever. And so people assume that if somebody's excellent at one level, they'll naturally just carry on and be excellent at another, when that broader level, broader and global scope actually requires additional competencies or higher levels of competencies than may have had to have at the lower A level, so to speak.
Great, thank you. We may have time for one more question, depending. So I will choose this one from Ursula. We have many, so we'll definitely follow up with each of you that asked questions that we're not able to get to today. But the question here from Ursula says, what do we know about the organizational context? For example, team setting, supporting these competencies.
Yeah, it's critical. What we know is that if the organizational context, and of course that can mean a lot of different things, so this is where I'm going with this, is that if the context, meaning C-suite mindset of top management, if they don't get this, if they don't get it that developing these competencies is important and actually strategic, the degree to which a consultant or the company itself can really work at developing their people is really aborted. It's like having one foot on the gas pedal and one foot on the brake at the same time. What I have found is that companies will let you, to different degrees, work with their people. They know they need more global leadership competencies in their people, but different companies will let you do different things. They'll let you go farther than other companies will. For example, they might say, yeah, do a personal plan with this person, but they're not really serious about it. And so maybe you work with the person, for 6 weeks or something, and then there's like, well, that's all the budget we have for it, and we're done. And so I'm very open to whatever any company is willing to let us do, because we want to help people. But the organizational contexts differ widely, between companies. I mean, some companies like IBM, they're willing to take high potentials out of their jobs, for like 2 months and put them in a context where research shows competencies can be really deeply increased. They see that as strategic. I was dealing with one organization and they were asking about this, and I said, well, how much training time do you have and how are you looking at that? And they said, well, we have half a day. That was their organizational context, half a day. Yeah, I guess I'm taking a long time to say the short answer to your question is yes, organizational context is massively influential in the degree to which global leadership competencies are going to be developed in their people.
Let me, and I know we're tight on time, but let me come at this a slightly different direction. Mark talked about kind of the overall structure. I've been working with a Japanese organization where the top management team is committed. We have taken out cohorts, small groups of 15 to 20 executives, and worked with them for a year on a fairly intensive process. And so there's a strong message from the top management team that this is important to us. We're investing time, we're investing resources in this. And that seemed to work well. As we tracked the progress of individuals in 1 year of that program, we noticed one individual did not seem to be developing. And it was really puzzling because on all of the measures we had, it looked like they ought to be. And as we dug down deep, what we discovered is while the organization had a commitment to that, his immediate line manager had no commitment, and in fact spent a great deal of time denigrating the program he was in, punishing him for being in the program, and consequently, the organization responded by moving him to a different unit where he had a more supportive manager. So there are some levels to this. And some shades to this are important, and it really drives home. It's a great question, Ursula. Really drives home the importance of understanding the organizational setting. This individual would have lost the developmental potential of that experience if we hadn't identified that issue that was part of the organizational context, and the company hadn't been willing to make that move on his behalf.
Let me give you I know we're short on time, but Alan and I really don't care because we're passionate about this. Let me give you an opposite of that. At a company we were working with where I would say the organizational context was so-so, I was at the company doing some consulting with them, and a guy I didn't know came up and said, "Can I take the GCI assessment again?" And I said, "Well, yeah, we can arrange that." I had not met him. Our other colleagues had worked with him like, I can't remember how long ago it was, like maybe 9 months or something. Yeah. And I said, why do you want to take it again? And he said, "I realized when I took that, I am not global, that I wasn't global at all. So you guys gave us some ideas of what to do. I've been working on 4 or 5 of them all by myself. We didn't know about this." So he took it again, and his scores increased. So this guy was working in an organizational context that really wasn't that great, but he had such high levels of developmental readiness, he just did it himself. So it's sort of an obverse of Alan's example. It's just really interesting how context does matter, but there's different levels of it.
Well, thank you so much, Mark and Allan. We want to be respectful of your time, and we did receive a lot of questions from you that we were not able to get to. So we'll put together some follow-up resources, things that we discussed today, as well as some responses to the questions that we were not able to get to. And we'll send all of that along with the recording and the slides from today, most likely by tomorrow. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Mark and Allan. It was a pleasure to have you today, and wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.